Hello and welcome to another episode of Peripheral Vision. Today we celebrate as a church the feast of the apostles Peter and Paul, the great solemnity where we acknowledge the two pillars of the Roman Church. And I'm also quite happy to say the day that I celebrated my ordination to the priesthood 7 years ago. But what's so interesting about these two saints is that both of them had to endure a mystery that is incredibly painful to learn, but yet absolutely essential for life in the church, but also for a healthy society. And yet, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to learn is that it goes against the very heart of us. Because in our deepest hearts, and I believe that this is in a sense God's fault, God created us to live in a world of justice. And so we fervently desire to be in a state of justice and a state of happiness. But then the sad thing is we tend to shortcut it. We think that we can get there either from a shortcut or at the very least by thinking, well, I've done enough. And I think that's honestly fairly reasonable. And especially this comes up when you've done your fair share, or at least what could justifiably called your fair share, and things still don't work out. Because then we can clearly say to others and to God, well, you know what, I've done my shot. I've done my part. I pulled up my bootstraps. I got the job done. So why don't you pick up the slack? But this is where it gets really kind of tragic. On an earthly level, that makes entire sense. But in the nature of the gospel, it is wrong. Flatly wrong. The very nature of our faith is that God, owing nothing to humanity, lays down his life for a sinful humanity in order to take away its sins. And while he's doing it, we resist him. On so many different levels, what God is saying is, you don't deserve it, but I'm doing it for you. And so if one can somehow maintain this, pick up oneself and do one's part while simultaneously confessing in the cross, it doesn't quite make any sense. And yet we do it. And yet we do it all the time because it's embedded in our sense of justice. It's embedded in our sense of righteousness. So inside the very nature of our Catholic faith is a rebellion against justice, which is terrifying when you think about it. And this is mostly apocryphal, but I believe it to be true. The very name of the enemy, the evil spirit, is Lightbringer. And justice and light are the same. They bring darkness into light. But as an accuser, the evil spirit is not doing justice, but asserting his own will. And he will mask it in justice. But in the end, he would prefer to keep his hatred than to create a just world. The justice is merely a mask that Satan will employ in order to deceive, but is quite happy, Satan is quite happy to sow misery in his name of justice. And so this leads human beings into an interesting paradox, the paradox of mercy. Do you want to forgive? Often the answer is no. Plainly, no. And we have our reasons. Life is precious. And when those destroy life, we have a feeling that they deserve justice. But that's not how God treated us. Because God knows that in the long run, our attempt to maintain the value of life often destroys the meaning of life itself. And this then leads us to the central paradox, in my estimation, in the lives of the apostles Peter and Paul. Peter undergoes it first, obviously, and it's intimately connected with today's gospel. When Jesus asks the disciples, who do you say that the Son of Man is? And they're like, well, no, who do the crowd say he's? So first it's like, what do other people think? And then, well, what do you think? And Peter chimes up, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus' response to Peter is, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. Therefore I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Yes! But here's the thing, right? If you're going to give a mortal like that such tremendous, see, I was going to say cosmic power, but that's wrong. It's divine power. It's greater than cosmic power. Jesus is giving to the apostles the authority that he has in himself to forgive sins is the most obvious example. And as discussed before, rightly that authority only belongs to God. But God gives it to these apostles. So of course, forgiveness being a divine prerogative, being given to mortals, the mortals who give it must know the cost. And the cost is feeling like a traitor to the world. Now, Jesus immediately after declares this to Peter. Then you get this. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This should never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not in the sight of God, but of men." When somebody says, "I can't forgive," and they think it unjust, I think they're right. I honestly think they're right. But the question is, what is justice? Now, the classic definition of justice is that all people get what is their due. And I think one of the reasons why at the very root of injustice is an injustice is that God created us for himself. And most injustices in this world are an attempt to get that dessert, that justice, from the world, which exhausts the world. The world can't pay that price. It is too high. This is why you can have a Pharaoh, for his own fear of death, pillage a whole nation's resources, people, to create monuments to his death. And this isn't just in Egypt. You see this in the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. It happens all the time, where the whole world is spent to give a meager salvation to a mortal. And yet, he treats himself as a god, not because he is, but because he just does it by comparison. And on one level, he can say, "But this is my right." And we have very little to do to argue with him. And this is one of the reasons why justice often goes into terrible impasses throughout history. Because our sense of justice is entirely entwined with those who oppress. This is why a society will tolerate injustice, because we think that at least one point in our life, I might be on the top of the heap, and I will be able to distribute my kind of justice. And what's so interesting about this is it exposes an idea of God that is idolatrous. It exposes an idea of God that is not only idolatrous from the Christian perspective, but from the Jewish one. Why did God create humanity? Does he need something from us? No. No, he doesn't. He created the human race and the whole cosmos because it's beautiful. And him being internally complete in himself, internally and eternally complete in himself, has no needs, and yet desires to give, and so creates, and then makes a covenant with a people who then abandon the covenants, But God then promises, not on the merits and the justness of the people to whom he has covenanted himself, but on his own name, promises a covenant. And what's interesting is that Jesus, the yes to all of these covenants, is giving us the deeper justice, that which is hardwired into nature itself. God's covenanting of his own being to our created nature. Which is why, even in creation itself, there are injunctions against our own vaunted sense of justice. We can have any number of morality plays describing to us the evils of revenge, either from Shakespeare or to recent video games like The Last of Us Part 2. But that's not the point. We feel like a traitor when we forgive. But yet, by holding to the malice and evil, we lose the things we claimed to love. Revealing that using the world to create justice only creates more evil. And that this world needs God, but not the false one, not the God who takes life, but gives it. Now, this mystery is also played out in the Apostle Paul, who early in his life is known as Saul, and works incredibly hard in order to maintain the traditions of his ancestors. And rightly so. Every child should do everything that they can to bring out the best that their people have to offer, and also be willing to challenge them and to say when we have not been living up to our own moral standards, and why in every generation, no new Christian generation can look at the past and say, oh, well, they did everything perfectly. It's like, wrong. There's no way. Just no way. But Saul, knowing this, still works to be able to build it up. But what he hears in the first Christian proclamation is that God is now willing to take the place of the criminal to those who do not deserve justice, and gives it to them. You can imagine his resentment and his sense that the just deserts of good people, of hardworking, faithful people, have been spat on. Sure enough. But in an attempt to remain faithful to the traditions of his ancestors, he rejected the very author of life. And so, like St. Peter, who, while being given the keys of the kingdom, realized that his heart was not there, St. Paul also had to go through the reversal of his own blindness, where he realized that the church that he is persecuting is the body of his Lord and God. And it would be a very painful thing for a person who is working for the righteousness of God to realize that he was not only his own worst enemy, but God's enemy, and that God still wants to show him mercy. That is both embarrassing and humiliating. And nobody should want to go through that. But everyone must. Just as St. Peter had to go through the same thing. His vaunted pride in the Last Supper, saying, Lord, I will never abandon you. And Jesus says, very truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And sure enough, Peter did. And he became that which he hated the most. And so when Peter is restored to his ministry by Jesus, it is buried in that Peter is unworthy of the ministry that he now holds. It's not something that Peter didn't know from the beginning. When he has the big catch of fish, Jesus, he sees Jesus as Lord then and there. Just as we can see Jesus as Lord from the beginning of our life and yet go through a new conversion when we discover how much more he needs to build and dig into our lives. So St. Peter, St. Paul, both of them had to realize that God's power is revealed in weakness, and that God's weakness is greater than human strength. And this is what bears in us the capacity of bringing out the greater righteousness, which is mercy. Mercy. And that all the sacrifices in the church are ordered towards that mystery. Now, yes, if a person refuses mercy, and we hopefully can understand why, then they are not ready to be given the full gift. This is why when the apostle says to us that if we do not discern the mystery, we are eating and drinking condemnation on ourselves. This is not simply for those who do not believe that the body and blood of Christ is in fact his body and blood. But it's deeper than that. If we contradict the mystery of the Eucharist by our own behavior and sometimes by our Eucharistic life, then we are heaping condemnations on ourselves. When we look at another person and say, "You're not worthy to come to this altar," it's like, well, what makes you think you are? That's not appropriate. It's like, nothing about you is appropriate. Think about the magnitude of the Eucharist. The magnitude of it. Paul was willing, and in a sense rightly, to put it all on the line for the glory of the God in the temple. And the new temple is with us. The crimes of blasphemy against the Eucharist are far worse. Far, far worse. But where does God really want to dwell? In a sinner who doesn't deserve him, but is doing their best. Now, honestly, if we think that we will find greater happiness in our sins than we will in a dedicated following of the Lord Jesus, that's where we should start. We're not quite ready to lay down our lives for a greater righteousness. But for those of us who want to deepen our Eucharistic life, realize that you are not worthy to receive him. All of our prayer and all of our fasting, all of our entire church life, we think we're helping God. No. He's condescending to us in every possible way. All the greatest art in church history is but a stick figure on a family's fridge. All the greatest art and music in church history amounts to Ralph Wiggum playing the flute through his nose. Unless we're willing to see all of our greatest efforts as infinitesimally small compared to his glory, we don't yet know him. But that's okay. He's merciful and kind. And when we realize how much we've undermined him, contradicted him, set human goals above his, how much we've broken his heart by our pride and arrogance and division and discord, and that we deserve nothing less but than to be blasted off the face of the earth. And and he lets us receive his body and blood one more time. And the answer is, go and do likewise. Happy feast of Peter and Paul, and stay faithful. God bless you.